Imagine walking into one of the oldest, most magnificent basilicas in the world. High above the altar, carved into a massive marble pillar, there is a name written in pure, gleaming gold. But if you look closely, you can see the jagged, violent scars beneath the precious metal. Long before the gold was poured, someone took a heavy iron chisel and desperately tried to hack that name out of existence. Who was this man? Why did an entire empire and his own spiritual brothers collude to wipe his memory from the face of the earth? We often think of history as a clear battle between good and evil, but sometimes the most devastating wounds are inflicted by those sitting right next to us in the pews. This is the breathtaking story of a beloved shepherd who was stripped of his ring, banished to the freezing desert, and ordered to be forgotten forever. Yet, in the terrifying silence of his exile, he did something so unexpected, so profoundly faithful, that it eventually saved the very institution that threw him away. What do you do when the world demands your silence, but heaven demands your truth? The sound of iron striking ancient marble echoed through the cavernous nave of the Grand Basilica. It was a cold, sharp, and unforgiving rhythm that cut violently through the lingering, sweet scent of Sunday incense. This was not the rhythmic sound of creation, nor the careful sculpting of a newly commissioned sacred monument. It was the heavy, deliberate, and devastating sound of erasure. High upon the central pillar of honor, a master stone mason was sweating profusely under the watchful, unblinking eyes of armed imperial guards. His heavy chisel was biting ruthlessly into the ancient stone. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. To truly comprehend why a man's entire earthly existence had to be so violently chiseled out of history, we must look back to a few weeks prior, to a morning that irrevocably shattered a peaceful Christian community. It was a quiet, luminous Sunday. The basilica was packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of faithful worshipers, their voices rising together in an ancient, harmonious hymn that seemed to make the very walls vibrate with devotion. At the center of the altar, illuminated by the soft, golden light of hundreds of beeswax candles, stood their beloved bishop. He was a man known throughout the Eastern Empire as a gentle, tireless shepherd and a brilliant, uncompromising defender of the faith. His hands were raised in a gesture of profound blessing, his eyes closed in prayer, when the heavy, bronze-studded doors of the cathedral were suddenly and violently thrown open. A heavily armed detachment of Roman imperial soldiers marched directly down the center aisle, their heavy, hobnailed sandals slapped against the polished stone floor, deliberately drowning out the sacred choir. They did not bow to the altar. They did not pause in reverence. The captain of the guard marched straight into the sacred sanctuary, unsheathing a tightly rolled parchment bearing the heavy red wax seal of the emperor. In a loud, booming voice that betrayed no emotion, he read a sudden decree of immediate, permanent banishment. A profound, suffocating silence immediately gripped the room. This was an era when the political stability of the late Roman Empire was desperately fragile. The emperors of this age believed that absolute, unquestioning religious uniformity was the only glue left to hold their fracturing vast borders together. The bishop had recently refused to align his orthodox theology with a new, politically convenient, but spiritually compromised imperial doctrine to the emperor sitting on a throne hundreds of miles away. This was not a matter of sacred theology or spiritual truth. It was a blatant act of treason. The soldiers did not even wait for the sacred service to conclude. Two armed guards stepped forward, their armor clattering with metallic hostility, and violently seized the aging bishop, right in front of his terrified, weeping congregation. They forcibly ripped the woolen pallium, the sacred, cross-adorned vestment symbolizing his pastoral authority and his yoke to Christ from his frail shoulders. The fabric fell to the cold stone floor in a crumpled heap. This was an incredibly calculated, deeply humiliating visual tactic. It was explicitly designed to show the masses that the crushing power of the secular state could unmake the sacred power of the church in a single instant. A collective, horrified gasp swept through the immense nave. People shrank back in sheer terror. Mothers desperately covered their children's eyes. Not a single person stepped forward to defend him, entirely paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming terror of imperial retaliation. But the true, enduring mystery of this heartbreaking moment was the bishop himself. There was no outrage in his eyes. There was no screaming, no frantic resistance, no calling down the righteous wrath of heaven upon his captors. Instead, with a quiet, heartbreaking, and breathtaking dignity, he bent down, picked up his fallen vestment, kissed it reverently, and turned to his weeping flock. He raised his bare hand, offered them one final, chiseled, and tearful blessing, and allowed himself to be led away in heavy iron chains. The massive wooden doors of the basilica slammed shut behind him with a terrifying finality. His name, once the spiritual heartbeat of his city, was now actively being turned into an empty, chiseled scar on a marble pillar. The physical banishment from his beloved cathedral and his terrified flock was only the first, brutal layer of the assault. The empire did not merely want him gone, they desperately needed him disgraced, ruined, and utterly discredited. A righteous martyr in chains is a dangerous inspiration, but a thoroughly disgraced leader is easily forgotten by history. Exactly 1 week after his violent public arrest, a localized council, what later Christian memory preserves as a robbers' synod, was hastily orchestrated by his political enemies. According to tradition, this gathering was not held in a place of worship, but in a dark, imposing administrative hall of the regional governor, heavily guarded by imperial soldiers, to ensure the correct theological and political outcome was reached without interference. The bishop was led into the center of the damp, dimly lit room. Across the heavy wooden tables sat men he had once broken bread with, men he had personally ordained, men he had considered his closest, most trusted spiritual brothers. Now, under the suffocating shadow of the empire, they could not even bring themselves to look him in the eye. They stared at the floor, shifting uncomfortably in their ornate chairs. Their silence bought, not by malice, but by profound human frailty, by fear, ambition, and the crushing, terrifying pressure of imperial threats. We must be careful not to view these men merely as cartoonish villains. They were terrified humans, desperately trying to survive in a ruthless political machine. The accusations formally read against him were masterclasses in political character assassination. They did not merely attack his complex, uncompromising theology, they systematically attacked his humanity and his integrity. They formally accused him of being violently arrogant and of stubbornly dividing the church just to feed his own massive pride. Then came the first, deeply devastating false explanation. A rumor meticulously designed to turn the common, starving people against him. They claimed he had been secretly embezzling sacred funds meant for the widows, the orphans, and the poor, using the money to finance a rebel faction against the throne. As these agonizing charges were read, A minor imperial official stepped forward from the shadows and demanded the bishop's ring. This was not a mere piece of jewelry. It was the ultimate, sacred symbol of his spiritual marriage to his diocese, passed down through generations of faithful shepherds. The bishop, his face pale but completely serene, quietly slid the heavy gold ring from his finger and placed it on the wooden table. It hit the wood with a hollow, tragic thud that echoed in the silent room. The official sneered, swiping the ring into a dark velvet pouch. It was a micro-exclusion of devastating proportions, of visual, undeniable severing of his identity and his life's work. The men in that room needed a scapegoat to preserve their own fragile peace. They demanded that the bishop confess to the fabricated charges and publicly recant his orthodox writings. If he did, they promised, the emperor would be merciful, and he could live out his days in quiet retirement. The bishop stood amidst the hostility, looking at the downcast, sweating faces of his former friends. He felt the freezing cold sting of their betrayal. Yet he consciously chose not to defend himself. He knew with absolute certainty that any words he spoke would be twisted, manipulated, and weaponized. He absolutely refused to validate a corrupt, politically rigged tribunal with a theological argument. His silence was profoundly unsettling to his accusers. It was the dignified, terrifyingly peaceful silence of Christ, standing before Pontius Pilate, infuriated by his calm, unyielding presence. The synod hastily passed its ultimate, devastating sentence, damnatio memoriae, the complete condemnation of memory. His theological decrees were ordered to be burned in the public square. His letters were to be hunted down and destroyed. Most painfully, his name was to be officially and permanently struck from the sacred diptychs, the liturgical lists of bishops prayed for during the Sunday Mass, to the empire, and to the institutional church of that specific moment. He was not just exiled, he was officially declared dead. The history books were to be violently rewritten as if this faithful shepherd had never existed at all. The ensuing journey into permanent exile was meticulously designed to break whatever spirit the aging bishop had left in his frail body. He was marched under heavy, relentless guard for weeks, pushed to the absolute limits of human physical endurance, until they finally reached a desolate, sun-scorched wasteland at the absolute farthest fringes of the known empire. His new prison was not a castle cell with iron bars, but a shallow, freezing limestone cave carved into the side of a barren desert cliff. The physical isolation was absolute and terrifying, but the true torment was the psychological and spiritual agony he was forced to endure in the silence. The Roman guards assigned to watch him treated the great theologian with a casual, cruel, and completely indifferent disregard. They mocked his physical frailty, tossing him his meager daily ration of stale, rock-hard bread and muddy, tepid water as if feeding a stray, unwanted animal. They laughed at the old man who still stubbornly wore the ragged, dust-covered remnants of his clerical undergarments, treating him as a pathetic, discarded relic of a forgotten religion that the empire had already crushed. But the deepest, most agonizing wound was not the freezing night air, nor the gnawing hunger, nor the daily humiliation from the guards. The most devastating pain came months later, delivered under the pitch-black cover of a desert night. A loyal merchant, risking his own life and livelihood, managed to sneak past the guards and smuggle a small, tightly rolled scrap of parchment to the bishop's cave. It contained absolutely devastating news from the capital. The beloved flock he had been forced to leave behind was currently being scattered and devoured by wolves. The new, imperially appointed bishop was systematically dismantling the orthodox teachings, introducing the exact theological compromises the emperor had demanded. Faithful, Unyielding priests were being driven into hiding or imprisoned. The community was deeply confused, starving for spiritual truth, and crying out in the dark for their exiled shepherd. Reading those desperate words in the dim, flickering, dying light of a tiny oil lamp, the bishop experienced a profound, intimately devastating spiritual wound. It was the crushing, suffocating agony of a loving father hearing his children crying out for help while he is securely locked behind an impenetrable iron door. He entered a profound, dark night of the soul. Why would God allow this? Why had God given him the wisdom to lead, the heart to love his people, only to chain him to a freezing rock in the desert while the church he loved was being systematically dismantled? A terrible, suffocating loneliness descended upon him, heavier than the stone of his cave. He was haunted by the terrifying fear that perhaps his life's work had been entirely in vain. Perhaps his uncompromising stance had been a foolish mistake. Perhaps God had truly abandoned the church to the ruthless hands of political tyrants. Yet, in this pitch-black night of the soul, a hidden, miraculous truth was quietly unfolding. The empire had assumed that total isolation would drive him mad, that the crushing silence of the desert would force him into a spiral of bitterness, rage, and despair. They fully expected him to use whatever precious little ink he could scavenge to write desperate, begging appeals to the emperor, or venomous, hateful letters cursing the weak men who had betrayed him. Instead, the bishop knelt on the freezing, unforgiving stone floor of his cave. He pulled a rough, fragile piece of parchment toward him. In the deepest, most agonizing silence of his entire life, stripped of his grand pulpit, his golden ring, his fine vestments, and his very name, he began to write. He did not write desperate defenses of his own character. He did not write plotting strategies to regain his throne. He wrote breathtakingly beautiful, soaring, and luminous theology about the eternal, unchanging nature of Christ. And more profoundly, according to the later Christian memory of the faithful, he wrote daily, tear-soaked prayers of intercession, begging God to pour out infinite mercy upon the very bishops who had condemned him and the emperor who had banished him. The sacred wound was unbelievably deep, but through the grace of God, he absolutely refused to let it turn into poison. Years bled into one another, completely unmarked in the timeless void of the desert. The bustling world of the capital moved on, and the empire assumed the exiled bishop had long since died of exposure, his bones turning to dust in his forgotten cave. But the political and theological landscape of the empire was deteriorating far more rapidly than the emperor had ever anticipated. The forced compromises the emperor had violently pushed upon the church did not bring the promised era of golden unity. Instead, they birthed 100 bitter, splintering factions. The very foundation of the Christian faith was fracturing, and the emperor's iron grip on the populace was slipping through his fingers like desert sand. One chilling evening, the eternal silence of the desert was abruptly broken by the thundering sound of approaching horses. An imperial envoy, dressed in unimaginably rich, shimmering silk and flanked by high-ranking, heavily armed Praetorian guards, arrived at the mouth of the bishop's cave. The visual contrast was jarring and surreal. The immense, staggering wealth and power of Rome standing at the threshold of a freezing, dirt-floored, wind-swept prison. The envoy stepped inside, his nose wrinkling violently at the damp, unwashed smell, and looked down at the frail, aging, white-haired man sitting calmly in the shadows. The envoy carried a polished wooden lockbox, He opened it slowly to reveal two specific items: a beautifully illuminated royal decree bearing a heavy, fresh red wax seal, and a pristine silver quill. Beside them, resting on a bed of velvet, sat the bishop's stolen gold ring. The emperor is gracious, and his wisdom is boundless. The envoy began, his voice slick with rehearsed, oily diplomacy. The capital is in utter turmoil. The people are violently divided. His Majesty recognizes that you, despite your past stubbornness, still command a certain hidden, lingering loyalty among the older generation. He offers you a path to immediate redemption. The envoy unrolled the decree. It was a brand new theological statement. "Sign this," the envoy whispered, his tone shifting from grand declaration to a conspiratorial, desperate urge. It is a very slight adjustment, a remarkably minor compromise in wording regarding the exact nature of the divine. Just enough ambiguity to please all the warring factions. Sign this one piece of parchment, and your banishment ends this very hour. You will be placed on a royal chariot. Your golden ring will be returned to your hand. You will walk back into your grand basilica as a conquering hero. You can finally protect your flock again. This was the absolute midpoint, the agonizing, heart-wrenching point of no return. The temptation was terrifyingly beautiful and exquisitely cruel. It wasn't an offer of shallow wealth or earthly power. It was an offer to let him be a loving shepherd again. He could end his freezing, bone-aching misery. He could physically save his people from the wolves tearing them apart. He could see his beloved home, smell the incense of his cathedral. One last time before he died. All he had to do was bend the truth just slightly. Just 1 millimeter of theological compromise. Just a single, ambiguous word. The envoy stepped closer, leaning in with a calculated micro-humiliation designed to finally break the old man's resolve. "Look at yourself," the envoy sneered softly, gesturing to the rags and the dirt. "You are rotting in the dark for nothing. The world has already forgotten your name. They literally chiseled it out of the stone. Remember, if you refuse this incredible mercy, you will die a ghost, and the desert winds will swallow your bones. Save yourself. Save your church." The bishop looked intently at the silver quill. He looked at the golden ring he had worn for decades, the ring that represented his life's love. Slowly, he raised his trembling, arthritic hand and touched his own empty ring finger. In that exact moment of profound, sweeping emptiness, he realized the ultimate, devastating truth: to love his flock, truly, to be a real father to them. He had to give them the uncorrupted, crystal clear truth of God, even if it meant he could never, ever see them again in this life. A poisoned well might temporarily quench a dying man's thirst for a single day, but it would inevitably kill him tomorrow. He looked up at the envoy, his eyes suddenly burning with a quiet, overwhelming spiritual fire that made the hardened Roman official instinctively step back in fear. The bishop did not shout. He did not argue. He simply shook his head gently, clasped his scarred hands together in peaceful prayer, and turned his back to the royal decree. The envoy's face flushed with violent, humiliated fury. "Then you will be erased forever," he spat, slamming the wooden lockbox shut with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. The guards turned on their heels, and the horses galloped away into the night, leaving the bishop to the encroaching darkness. He had just willingly signed his own death warrant. He had chosen the eternal, uncompromising truth of heaven over the fleeting, comfortable restoration of earth. Decades passed. The bishop quietly passed away in the desolate, freezing silence of his exile. His frail body buried in an unmarked, sandy grave by a few wandering, deeply faithful desert monks who had watched him from afar. The grand empire that had so arrogantly banished him eventually collapsed under its own weight, its capital sacked by invaders, its supposedly divine emperors overthrown and forgotten. But the church survived, though it was now facing the most severe existential theological crisis in its entire history. The exact theological ambiguities and political compromises that the old emperor had violently pushed were now threatening to tear Christianity apart completely. The faith was bleeding out from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. A massive, universal church council was desperately convened in a spectacular seventh, sunlit basilica in a newly established capital. Hundreds of bishops, scholars, and theologians from across the known world gathered. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly tense, heavy with the terrifying realization that they were entirely lost. For weeks, they argued, debated, and despaired. They were desperately searching for the precise language, the exact theological framework needed to defend the Orthodox faith and heal the devastating, generation-long schism. But the modern scholars were completely paralyzed. The institutional blindness and the cowardly compromises of the past decades had left them without a clear, unifying voice. They were drowning in a sea of ambiguity. On the final, exhausting day of the council, when it seemed the gathering would end in a catastrophic, historic failure, a strange disturbance occurred at the massive bronze doors of the basilica. An ancien, weather-beaten monk, his skin like worn leather from the deep desert sun, walked slowly into the grand hall. He was ignored at first, treated by the guards as an unwelcome intrusion, but under his tattered, dusty cloak, he carried a simple, beautifully carved wooden box. He walked straight down the center aisle, past the staring, bewildered eyes of the most powerful men in the religious world, directly to the elevated podium. The presiding archbishop, exhausted and frustrated, demanded to know what this man was doing, interrupting a sacred council without a single word. The monk opened the box and carefully, reverently lifted out a massive stack of fragile, yellowed parchment scrolls. They were deeply stained with the dust of the desert, the sweat of an exiled man, and the tears of decades of solitary prayer. These, the monk announced, his voice crackling with an undeniable, prophetic authority through the total silence of the basilica, are the writings of the Shepherd of the East, written in the dark, preserved by God. A ripple of highly uncomfortable murmurs swept rapidly through the younger bishops. Some actually mocked the idea. Why should we listen to a man legally condemned by a synod? One arrogant bishop challenged from the back. His name was erased from the diptychs before we were even born. He is a ghost. But the presiding archbishop, a very old man who still faintly remembered the heartbreaking stories of the unjust exile from his childhood, raised his trembling hand for absolute silence. He took the incredibly fragile scrolls, unrolled the first one, and began to read it aloud as the words filled the cavernous, echoing room. A profound, incredibly heavy, and deeply sacred silence fell over the hundreds of assembled leaders. The revelation was absolutely staggering. The theology meticulously written on those rough, desert scrolls was brilliant, precise, and completely, miraculously untainted by the political compromises of the era. The exiled bishop had not just defended the faith in his agonizing, freezing isolation. stripped of all earthly distractions, all political pressure, and all human comforts. He had seen the nature of Christ with a blinding clarity that no one sitting in comfortable palaces could ever possibly possess. The public confrontation was no longer a trial of a living man. It was a devastating trial of history itself. The hidden truth was finally, undeniably laid bare. The very man the institution had cowardly thrown away to save itself had spent his dying breaths forging the exact theological key they desperately needed to survive today. The deafening silence, the human fear, and the institutional cowardice of the previous generation had cost the church decades of unnecessary agony, division, and spiritual darkness. As the archbishop finished reading the final scroll, which ended not with a brilliant theological argument, but with a deeply moving, tear-stained prayer of absolute forgiveness for the men who had banished him, grown men in the Grand Council fell to their knees and wept openly. The hidden truth completely and irrevocably inverted their understanding of the past. The man they had erased was the only one who had truly remained faithful. The stone that the builders had violently rejected had just become the irreplaceable cornerstone of their theology. The divine vindication of the exiled bishop did not come in the form of a dramatic lightning bolt striking down his enemies, nor did it manifest as a bitter, vengeful curse upon those who had wronged him. God's justice is rarely a cheap, theatrical revenge. It is morally symmetrical, infinitely specific, and unbelievably profound. The restoration began immediately within the very walls of that weeping council, by a unanimous, tearful, and deeply repentant decree. The false, politically motivated judgments of the robbers' synod from decades past were officially and permanently annulled. The documents that had condemned him were physically torn to pieces. His sweeping theology was definitively declared the absolute gold standard of orthodoxy, ensuring that every single future generation of the church would be guided by the luminous words he wrote in the freezing dark. But the divine restoration did not end merely with ink on paper. According to the deeply cherished historical memory of the faithful, a grande, unprecedented procession was organized to venture back into the deep, unforgiving desert. They meticulously located his unmarked, windswept, sandy grave and carefully, reverently unearthed his fragile bones. They did not bring him back in a common wooden cart hidden in the night. They placed his sacred remains in a magnificent, towering golden reliquary, adorned with the finest jewels of the new empire, and carried him back to the capital city on the shoulders of the highest-ranking bishops in the world. The very gates of the great city that had once expelled him as a chained, humiliated criminal were now thrown wide open in joyous triumph. The descendants of the powerful emperors and politicians who had banished him now stood by the roadside in the thousands, removing their crowns, dropping to their knees, and bowing deeply as his gleaming reliquary passed by in the sunlight. He was brought back, step by step, into the very same magnificent basilica where his vestments had been violently stripped from his shoulders all those years ago. This was a staggering, awe-inspiring moral reversal. The political elites who had orchestrated his downfall had all faded into the meaningless dust of time. Their vast empires had crumbled to ash. Their unimaginable wealth was gone, and their immortal names were now remembered only as minor footnotes referenced solely to explain the story of the righteous man they had so foolishly tried to destroy. They had tried to bury him in the absolute silence of the desert, but heaven had carefully preserved his voice to echo forever in the grand halls of history. Justice had been fully earned in the agonizing crucible of absolute, unwavering faith. For anyone listening to this story who feels hidden, misunderstood, or unjustly erased by the loud, arrogant powers of this world, let this be a profound healing to your soul. God does not forget a single tear dropped in the dark, He sees the quiet faithfulness that the world ignores. What the world attempts to erase through power, intimidation, and silencing, God meticulously restores in the blazing light of his perfect timing. The grand procession finally reached the high altar. The massive choir sang the exact same ancient hymn that had been so violently interrupted so many years ago, their voices soaring to the heavens. But the most powerful, enduring image of his sacred restoration was not the golden box resting on the altar, nor the chanting of the repentant bishops. It was found high above them, on the central marble pillar, the scarred, deeply chiseled, empty indentation. The exact place where the terrified stonemason had violently hacked away his name had not been smoothed over. It had not been replaced with a new stone to hide the church's past sin. Instead, the faithful had taken pure, molten, gleaming gold and poured it directly into the jagged wounds of the marble. The solid gold now filled every harsh cut and broken edge, spelling out his name in a breathtaking display of resurrected glory. The golden letters caught the brilliant afternoon sunlight streaming through the high basilica windows, shining brighter and more magnificently than anything else in the massive room. His name was permanently, beautifully fused into the very foundation of the church, a dazzling, eternal testament that what you lose in holy silence will always, ultimately, be restored in front of the world. The story of the exiled bishop is a profound meditation on the timeline of divine justice and the incredible weight of holy silence. We live in a modern culture that demands immediate vindication. When we are misunderstood, falsely accused, or pushed aside, our first instinct is to fight back, to scream our truth, to drag our enemies into the light. But the bishop chose a beautifully different path. His exile teaches us that true spiritual courage sometimes looks like absolute earthly defeat. He was stripped of his title, his flock, and his reputation, yet he retained the only thing that truly mattered: his unbreakable communion with Christ. Furthermore, this story forces us to look honestly at the fragility of human institutions. The men who condemned him weren't monsters. They were terrified individuals bowing to the severe political pressures of their day. It is a sobering reminder that fear can make even the most faithful people do terrible things to preserve their own comfort. Yet, the grace of God is vast enough to weave even our most cowardly mistakes into a tapestry of redemption. The bishop didn't use his desert isolation to plot revenge or write letters of bitter outrage. He used it to pray for his persecutors and protect the purity of the faith. His legacy reminds us that you cannot permanently bury the truth. What is lost in the quiet obedience of faith is always preserved in the archives of heaven. We are often tempted to compromise our deepest convictions just to keep the peace or retain a seat at the table. But God does not measure our lives by the applause of our contemporaries. He measures it by our quiet fidelity in the dark. Thank you so much for taking this journey into the quiet, sacred history of the early church with us. If this story of hidden faith and divine restoration touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need encouragement today, and subscribe to our channel. Your support is what helps us continue uncovering these forgotten, sacred memories. We would deeply value hearing your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a season of profound silence or misunderstanding where you had to trust entirely in God's timing for your vindication? How did you find peace while waiting in the dark? Please share your reflections. Your words might be exactly what another viewer needs to read today. Make sure your notifications are turned on. And join us in our next video, where we will unearth the haunting story of a sealed crypt beneath a bustling Roman street, and the astonishing, hidden message left behind by a community facing the ultimate test of faith. We will see you there.